Welcome to the RD Squeeze. I'm Nikki.
And I'm Emily.
And we're two dietitian besties here to squeeze out the misinformation around health and nutrition.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 31, season 4. We have a repeat guest on from episode 30, Aubrey Redd, and of course, Mickey, our other host, lovely host, is here. So we are going to introduce Aubrey again to you. She's the owner and lead dietitian at Aubrey Redd Nutrition, LLC, where she provides personalized outpatient counseling with a focus on sustainable lifestyle changes. In her private practice, she provides compassionate, evidence-based nutrition education, specializing in hormonal, fertility, prenatal, and overall wellness for women. She also now serves as the culinary nutrition manager at Unite for Her and an adjunct professor at Immaculata University. Aubrey holds a master's in community nutrition from Westchester University, and she is a recognized speaker presenting at national and regional conferences and actively engaged in leadership roles within the Pennsylvania and Philadelphia Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Nutrition Entrepreneurs Dietetic Practice Group, and Diversify Dietetics. So welcome back, Aubrey. We are so excited to have you back again right after your previous episode.
Thank you. I'm excited to be back. I'm happy to be here again.
So we're going to dive further into some women's health topics. And I think the topic last time was super important that everyone heard about. So this time we're going to talk about fueling your flow, phase by phase tips to nourish your cycle. I think this is such a huge topic today, and I see it all over social media about what to eat, what not to eat, what to help with sleep, and things like that for your cycle. So we're going to dive right all into that.
Yeah, I think I just want to, say, I think that people, it's a hot trend, but also people don't talk about this enough. Especially women's health, it kind of gets glossed over a lot, and we just don't focus on, there's different times of your cycle that you need certain nutrients and things like that. And that's where Aubrey really has her expertise, and we're excited to dive into that. So we learned about hormones in the first episode with Aubrey, and now we're going to dive into the cycle phases and what we need to do to kind of nourish our body, and why is this a hot trend right now too. So I think it's going to be a great episode.
Yeah. And I think it's so, if I can even just dive into why I think it's a hot trend, I feel like it's just becoming more popular, I think, for women to listen to their bodies, which thank goodness that's becoming more popular. But also, I think a lot of people are moving away from hormonal birth control. And so hormonal birth control suppresses ovulation. We don't necessarily see the ebbs and flows of our menstrual cycle when we're on hormonal birth control. And so I think as people are starting to taper away and utilize that less, we're noticing I feel very different at different times during these 28 to 32 days, and there are times that I feel great and there are times that I don't feel great. And so I think that's just why it's becoming so much more popular, is really the surge of people moving away from hormonal birth control and identifying I do have a cycle and there are different parts of it. So it's just really interesting to dive in.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree. And I do think that we don't have enough information on it either. Like I said, I don't think people talk about it enough. And the pros and cons of birth control, I mean, from I'm sure all of us at one point, in a personal standpoint, you go to your doctor or gynecologist with an issue and they're like, oh, birth control will fix that. So then you just go on birth control and you don't think anything of it. So I do like that people are, taking back kind of that autonomy of okay, I don't need to just go on birth control and to each their own. It doesn't matter what you decide to do and what's best for your body, but I do like the trend of this. But I'm sorry, Em, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. No, I think it's more of that holistic approach to our health, which, as Aubrey, you said, we're like paying more attention. We're more in tune with our body. We're looking at signals. We're listening to what our body is saying. And that's mindfulness. And that's almost like a stress reduction response, I will say, if you will, of just trying to figure out what is your body saying instead of this is what medical providers say I have to do. I'm taking control of my body.
Absolutely. And I think kind of how you said, Mickey, very much to each his own, right? I'm not anti hormonal birth control. I think that there's lots of, important uses. And I think it is just that aspect of autonomy of I have this decision making power over my health trajectory and all of these factors that impact my health. So I can also make the decision to not be on that if I would choose to. I mean, I know personally, I think I was put on hormonal birth control when I was 14 or 15 because I had acne. And my PCP was just like, yeah, we'll just start you on the birth control pill. And maybe it helped my acne at the time. I don't know. But thinking about it from that perspective, I think a lot of us just have kind of been given that narrative of, this is what we're all doing. So I do think people are maybe even just doing their own research a little bit more right now on things that are important to them. And so I think definitely our cycles, as women, it's important to all of us.
Yeah, and it's options as well. It's not one option anymore. There's multiple options to maybe how to go about treating or controlling the menstrual cycle and what effects it has on our body. So do you have, you kind of mentioned yourself that you had a little bit of a personal experience, but are there any stories from maybe clients, patients of yours that stick out about like why they maybe came to you for nutrition information on what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks that I work with, either are navigating their cycle in a way that they never have before. So they're maybe off of hormonal birth control, or maybe they've lost their period for a particular reason, whether it's PCOS or something of that nature. Or I do connect with a lot of people who are trying to conceive and working on their fertility journey. And so I think from both respects, I've seen such positive outcomes in considering nutrition as an aspect of that role. I think especially when it comes to just the cycle health aspect of things, really seeing a lot of my clients have more of a diminish in some of their PMS symptoms. And so some of their fatigue and their cramps and just generally feeling that kind of blah, that we see when it comes with PMS. But also at the same time, I think really seeing the power in people maximizing the phases of their cycle, right? So leaning into, okay, I know that during this specific phase, maybe I have more energy. So this is when I'm going to do my harder strength training, for example, versus I'm going to move my body in a different way during different types of the cycle. So thinking about that, I think I've seen people just feel more empowered because perhaps their energy was ebbing and flowing and they didn't really identify why or know why. And so they thought it was personal, right? They thought it was just a lack of willpower or not feeling motivated. But once they started tracking their cycle and identifying, oh, I'm actually in my luteal phase, and that's why I maybe don't have as much energy today. I think it was helpful just to put that power back in their hands of there is maybe this reason behind why I'm feeling this way, right? It's not just me. It's not just out of thin air. It's part of this biology.
Yeah, I think that's really great, and I do think that can be confusing, especially navigating it coming off of birth control or something like that, or just navigating, you're not getting your period and you're not sure well, where am I, at what phase should I be at, and just kind of having that support, I'm sure, is super helpful. But I think that's a good transition to what are all these phases, because you mentioned luteal phase, and some people might be like, I have no idea what that is. And so let's get into it. Let's talk about what the different phases are.
Yeah. And I don't know about you ladies, but kind of cumulatively, I feel like I never learned this, right? I don't ever remember learning it like in middle school health class. I don't remember learning about it in high school. I don't even remember learning about it, right, like from my gynecologist or even in school to become a dietitian. I feel like it is just not talked about. The phases.
It's not. I mean, I knew that like we had a 28-day cycle, and then like towards the end of your cycle, that's when you menstruate and like when you have your period. But like, I didn't know that there was like another phase, like I knew there was ovulation. I think we talk about that a little bit, but like I said, I didn't know there was all these different phases and like there were actual names for it, and like that there were dips and ebbs and flows, like you said, and pun intended, like there's all different things happening in your body, and you just don't, like I said, it almost felt taboo to talk about, almost like it just wasn't a thing. So yeah, I nobody ever talks about this stuff.
Well, and let's bring up the fact of just women's health is coming out so much more now. We have women's health specific providers in numerous health professions. We don't just have OBGYNs anymore. We have fertility specialists. We have, those who are prenatal and maternal. Like, you have specialized care now. And I think that's helping get the word out, but also legislation, policy, advocacy. That's what's helping get the word out. Things like fibroids, like those things are just starting to come out, and it's not talked about. And so I think having this conversation is super important, not just on the nutrition end, but just women's health in general, to ensure women are able to take care of their bodies. And as we already said, listen to their bodies, understand their body more, and find out what's going to work best for them.
Absolutely. And I do think that, especially if you're somebody listening and you're thinking, I don't know the phases of my menstrual cycle, or I'm not getting a menstrual cycle, or maybe I don't know when I'm in what phase. I think just reinforcing that there can be so much power in trying to learn that about yourself, right? You're taking that next step to understand your body a little bit better. And our body is just this complex thing that I think sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense. So trying to, get down to that, whether it's through tracking your cycle, right? Maybe you're going back to the OB and you're talking about your birth control that you're on and what might work best for you. I think it's important to self-advocate, which I know we shouldn't always have to, but sometimes we do have to. But I think it can, again, be really powerful to have this understanding. So to kind of jump in, there are 4 phases in our menstrual cycle. We have our menstrual phase. So that's when we are actively having our period. So we're shedding that uterine lining. Then we have our follicular phase, which those kind of cross paths, follicular and menstrual, but the follicular phase keeps going up until ovulation. So it's typically about days 1 to 14. Your menstrual period could be anywhere from 3 to 4 days up to maybe 7 or 8 days. It's very normal if it's differentiating. During this follicular phase, this kind of next phase, our estrogen is rising, and also our pituitary gland releases something called follicle stimulating hormone. This releases these fluid-filled sacs called follicles that have immature eggs in them. Over the follicular phase, one of them becomes mature, and then we ovulate, or we release that mature egg. So for somebody who's going through a fertility journey, that is the prime time for conception, right? Or if you are, let's say, not using hormonal birth control and you are not intending to get pregnant, that is the prime time for protection, right? We want to be cautious around that time. Your ovulatory phase is typically just a few days, where you're ovulating about 1 or 2 days. That brings us into our luteal phase, which I feel like is the phase I hear talked about most often on social media. That's because we have those changes in our body. Our progesterone starts rising. So our body also releases luteinizing hormone, which, to go in the briefest way possible, our corpus luteum helps us to thicken our uterine lining so that we can have implantation if we do want to get pregnant. or we will prepare to shed that during menstruation. But it's that rise in progesterone during the luteal phase that typically makes us feel kind of blah, kind of sluggish, low energy. We don't really feel our best. I think that's why I hear about the luteal phase most often, because we're not feeling the greatest during that phase. And it is a pretty decent sized chunk of our cycle. It's typically around day 16 until day 28 when we are then having our period. We usually start to see those PMS symptoms towards the end of that luteal phase as we lead up to getting our period. So that's kind of just a brief overview. We have menstruation, follicular phase, ovulation, and then our luteal phase as our ebbs and flows in our cycle.
I think that is a great description. And so, Aubrey, what do you think about, nourishing our bodies for each phase of that? Is there something that we should be doing for each phase? Is there specific foods or nutrients that we're lacking, or, how does that affect our hormone health? With that, let's get into that then.
Yeah. So I think ultimately what I think is so important is just the key of a well-balanced diet, right? A well-balanced diet and movement, I think, spans across all phases. So it's not that we necessarily want to eat fast food during one phase and then eat healthy during another phase, quote unquote. So that general, more healthful and more well-balanced diet is going to span across all of the phases of our menstrual cycle. But there's definitely considerations that we want to think about when it comes to each phase. So starting with our menstrual phase, we're getting our period. So if you can imagine, we're shedding this uterine lining. We're losing that blood, as you see, whether it's on your pad or your tampon, what have you. We want to replenish with iron-rich food. So a lot of times when we think of blood and blood values, we think of iron. Those two kind of go together. So a lot of times when we first think of iron-rich foods, we usually think of red meat, which certainly is a source of iron, but also we find it a lot in our beans and our lentils, our dark leafy greens like collards, kale, for example. One thing I love to highlight that I think is not talked about enough is that we can absorb that dietary iron 3 to 4 times over when we consume it with sources of vitamin C. So vitamin C is mostly, I usually just say it's in all of our produce, pretty much, right? It's in most of our fruits and our vegetables. Usually, if you're trying to really pinpoint, I would say think bright reds, oranges, yellows. So tomatoes, carrots, pineapple, red and orange bell peppers, really good source of vitamin C to help us absorb that iron. So maybe you're enjoying, let's say, a soup or something of that nature because you want something warm and comforting because you're on your period, and you make it with maybe some ground beef, some beans, some lentils, but then you're also putting in some tomatoes, some diced up peppers, some carrots, so that you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting your iron, and then you're also getting your vitamin C. Again, I think it's important throughout all cycles, but definitely hydration is important, especially while you're getting your period. And sometimes I'll recommend leaning into more anti-inflammatory foods. So anti-inflammatory foods are typically mostly all of our plant foods, fruits, veggies, beans, lentils, nuts, seeds, whole grains. And then with the addition of our fish and our seafood, because they contain omega-3 fatty acids, which help with inflammation, this can just help with some of that cramping that we get throughout our period. So sometimes with that inflammation, it can worsen and exacerbate some of that cramping that we get. It also can just make us feel more sluggish and more fatigued. So leaning into more of those plant foods, the fish and seafood as well, is another avenue to go when it goes during our menstrual phase. So those would be my recommendations, at least for the menstrual phase. Before I move on to follicular, what are we thinking?
Now, what about and I can't pinpoint one, but I'm sure you can. What about some other things beyond the typical, food groups that we recommend? I do the exact same for iron-rich foods. I love how you describe it, making it simple for clients. because when we pinpoint certain foods, it then says other foods aren't as good, but they still are, because if we're not eating any of those foods, then we're not getting vitamin C, we're not getting iron. So it's not that any food is better than others. Most foods are going to have some change in difference in their vitamin C content, but that's exactly what I say. Fruits and vegetables, and look for color, because you're going to get antioxidants or vitamin C and other, antioxidant rich nutrients in there. So I love that. I love how you described it. But like, what about other things to help with the cramping and just the sluggishness maybe? I'm thinking along more of that holistic realm, maybe like herbals, teas, things like that.
Yeah, I definitely think leaning into more warm and comforting meals is typically where I put a lot of my recommendations. You might not be in the mood for like a fresh, bright salad during your period. I also think it's important to lean into foods that are comforting to you, right? Mickey, Emily, myself, we all probably have foods that are our own comfort foods, either foods we grew up with, foods that we really love and enjoy now. So I always recommend, making space for those comfort foods. And also the concept that it doesn't necessarily have to be healthified, right? I think a lot of times, I don't want to say we ruin comfort foods, but we don't want to ruin it for ourselves, a comfort food, by saying, okay, well, I love mac and cheese, but like I have to put a bunch of veggies into the mac and cheese.
100%.
You don't necessarily. You absolutely could if you want to, if you're trying to increase that. However, I would say typically, I do recommend just like making some space for yourself to enjoy those comfort foods, especially if you have been more mindful of your consumption of those throughout other phases, right? Maybe you're saying, okay, well, I don't necessarily want to, I don't know, order pizza, throughout my cycle, but maybe on my period is when I'll, have the pizza that I want, for example. I would say when it comes to more of those like herbal side of things, definitely leaning into, I'll recommend like peppermint or ginger a lot, because sometimes people will have some GI distress around the time of their period. And peppermint and ginger are both very soothing, particularly ginger, especially used in a fresh format. It has an antioxidant called gingerol, which can help break down just some of that gas release from our food, so it can help with like the bloating and the discomfort there. So I would say definitely sipping on some mint or some ginger tea, or maybe adding mint or ginger to your food from an herbal perspective, but definitely leaning into like warm and comforting dishes is my top priority.
Ooh, like you said too with the soup, like throw ginger in there. I think that's a great option too, if that's something warm and comforting.
Exactly. And then maybe a little less of the tummy issues will come with it.
Yeah. And I think we all kind of have the same standpoint of like listening to your body. And like you mentioned, Aubrey, and we've mentioned this in episodes in the past, like you don't have to necessarily healthify the food, because what happens when you do that? It's not exactly what you wanted anyway then. Like it's not that nostalgic food, or that evoking that feeling that you wanted from that food to begin with. So, you're kind of just setting yourself up to be disappointed anyway. So, like, just lean into that. Just lean into whatever, you're craving. I mean, you said mac and cheese. That's one of my comfort foods. Like, if I'm having a bad day, I'm like mac and cheese and chocolate. And we tend to go to those kinds of things. But if someone said, "Oh, we'll make it with butternut squash," I would laugh in their face and be like, "That's not mac and cheese. Like, that's not what I'm asking for." I love a good, adding nutrient to the recipe type of, vibe. I do love that, but not when you're miserable and all you want is something comforting. So I appreciate that you made that point as well, because I think we tend to have that guilt of like, should I really lean into that, or can I still healthify it? And it's like, you don't need to. You're setting yourself up for disappointment.
Yeah. And I think I bring that up a lot with cravings, because as I'm sure we've all experienced and we all know, right, a lot of times cravings can come with particularly menstruation, but just generally in life, right? Like a lot of times we have cravings. And I think when we substitute a craving, I think we're just not setting ourselves up for success, because if you're really craving chocolate and you say, okay, well, strawberries are sweet. I'll have strawberries instead of chocolate. What's going to happen is you're going to eat the strawberries, and then you're probably going to eat the chocolate too, because you're also going to really be hungry for the chocolate still. Or maybe you'll push it off, and then you'll end up eating like a big bowl of chocolate ice cream when really you were just intending to have a couple Dove chocolate squares. So I think it's important to lean into and incorporate those things that you're craving, especially too, we are more prone to cravings during that menstrual phase and the luteal phase too. So I think, again, making space for those ebbs and flows.
I think that's awesome. So, I mean, we love that, and we wholeheartedly support that. So I guess we talked about the menstrual phase. Is there differences for the other phases? So should we focus on different nutrients during the other phases? So I don't know, Aubrey, which phase do you want to cover next, and what makes most sense?
Yeah, I think it makes most sense to go into the follicular phase. And follicular and ovulation, because they're so close and because the ovulatory phase is so short, I wouldn't say there's a ton of different recommendations for the ovulatory phase unless you're trying to get pregnant, which we can touch on that in just a second. But during the follicular phase, I would say the primary things that I am considering are getting in healthy fats. So particularly our omega-3 fatty acids are helping us with hormone production and hormone balance. So we're thinking about the follicular phase, we're having this rise and this creep up of our estrogen. We also have our FSH, our follicle stimulating hormone that's releasing the follicles. So we want to get in a good amount of our healthy fats during our follicular phase. So these are things like avocado, nuts and seeds, plant oils, and even thinking about our fatty fish, for example, for those omega-3s. So this is going to help with hormone production and regulation. Now, because we're having this kind of surge of estrogen, particularly leading into our ovulation, we do also want to think about estrogen clearance, right? We don't necessarily want to have too much estrogen. And so what we can do to consider that is we can incorporate more fiber-rich foods, because fiber helps to bind to estrogen to pass it out in our waste. I think fiber, so beneficial for so many things, but I always like to talk about, I feel like fiber just grabs onto those things we don't really want, and it helps get rid of them in our body. We talk about it with cholesterol too. So thinking about that, fiber is going to help to bind to some of that high excess of estrogen and move it through our body. So those are our whole grains, our fruits and veggies, particularly ones that we're going to eat the skin of, like apples and pears, our beans and our lentils, and then even our seeds. So things like hemp hearts, chia seeds, flax seeds, which kind of a combo food, right? We're going to get some healthy fats, and then we're also going to get, in some of that fiber. Moving into the ovulatory phase, if you are thinking about getting pregnant, and even throughout your follicular phase, some other considerations you would potentially want to make are increasing your intake of foods that are rich in zinc and your foods that are rich in antioxidants. Both of these help with egg quality. So we want to make sure that we have a mature egg that is going to be binded to that sperm so that we can create a baby. So thinking about that, we want to get in these foods that are going to help improve your egg quality. So the zinc is typically found in most of our protein-rich foods. So thinking about nuts, seeds, beans, lentils, some of our animal-based proteins as well. Think like tuna and other fish. And then our antioxidants, same kind of concept as vitamin C. Think fruits and veggies, think bright colors. So if it kind of makes sense, with the redundancy here, I do think that there is, again, such a benefit to just that balanced diet, right? Getting in lots of these various foods, because we can see they have different roles during different phases of our cycle. But main thing with follicular phase is healthy fats and fiber. So those are going to help us with our energy too, because during your follicular phase, you typically have more energy. You're feeling a little bit more energized because of this rise in estrogen. So we want to keep that good time going by maintaining some good energy during that time.
I was going to ask, is there a time where we actually have energy as women?
It feels like no, right? But it is during that follicular phase. So it does start, technically at the beginning of menstruation, but let's say from the point you're done with your period until the point you're done ovulating, this is that time that you're going to see your energy rise. So a lot of times people also feel more social. Maybe they'll feel just like a little bit more into themselves, right? You might see like your libido rise as well too. A lot of times women are just feeling better during this time in their cycle. And so typically I'll recommend maybe trying new things, whether it's trying cooking a new recipe, going to a new restaurant, doing a new exercise or fitness activity, because I think it's really time that you can capitalize on during your cycle.
Yeah, and I was going to say, maybe this is the time, Mickey, that then you try the butternut squash mac and cheese.
Yeah, then I might be more willing to do that because I won't be so miserable.
It's a perfect time to try the butternut squash mac and cheese.
And again, nothing wrong with butternut squash mac and cheese. I'm just saying, like, there's a time and place, and now is not like the follicular phase is apparently that time and place.
We're not haters here, butternut squash is okay. Now, moving into our luteal phase, that depends on if you would potentially want to have your butternut squash mac and cheese, because that's when we start to kind of feel, I guess you could say, less like yourself again. So I would say the follicular phase is what I would define as like feeling most like yourself, quote unquote. So you're feeling your best self. You've got the most energy. You've got pretty much no symptoms when it comes to like menstruation or PMS. And you're really just feeling yourself and feeling very energized. Now, as our luteal phase begins, we start to produce more progesterone. And so this is that process of either the implantation of the fertilized egg, or we're preparing to have our period and our uterine lining and our corpus luteum are starting to break down. Now, thinking about that, while the progesterone is the impact that's maybe not making us feel the best, we do still want to think about supporting our progesterone levels, because it is important to especially prevent pregnancy if we don't want to get pregnant, but also to get pregnant if we do want to. So vitamin B6 can be really helpful when it comes to our progesterone levels. So vitamin B6, I feel like, is in a lot of different foods, or B vitamins tend to just kind of be really across the board when it comes to different foods. Things like bananas, chickpeas, tuna, for example, are some good sources of vitamin B6. But just in general, a lot of times our B vitamins overall can be helpful for energy during this time. So leaning into also things like our nuts and our seeds, in addition to beans and lentils, we see a lot of B vitamins there from our whole grains as well too. So I think plant sources of protein are going to be a good way to get an extra boost of energy. Also, those plant sources of proteins, right? Beans, lentils, whole grains, they're also going to help with things like mood and energy, because they're going to give us more stability when it comes to our blood sugar, which tends to be a big impactor on our mood, energy, our cravings, and it's that fiber and that protein we see there that helps to give us just more consistent blood sugar, more consistent energy, feeling a little bit better. Now, we can certainly target different PMS symptoms with some of the things we've already talked about, right? So if you're having issues with like bloating or gas or feeling really puffy, that's when you could tap into maybe some of these herbal remedies like ginger. A lot of times people will say that they have issues with bloating or puffiness, so I'll talk a lot about eating maybe a little lower sodium during your luteal phase as well too, in addition to staying well hydrated. This helps you to just feel a little bit like you're retaining less water, holding on to less fluids. So that's another consideration to make. But I think when it comes to the different PMS symptoms, it's really important to think about that blood sugar stability, because I think at the end of the day, that's where a lot of the symptoms really can stem from, is just these ebbs and flows that we tend to see in our blood sugar, because then we start to have cravings, and then we're eating maybe high carbohydrate foods and we're having a spike in our blood sugar. So then we're feeling sluggish. It's just kind of like a tumbleweed effect.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think something too that I see a lot in the mostly women population, but in men as well too, is skipping breakfast and using caffeine maybe. So what is there anything about caffeine that maybe we should like monitor when we're going through these phases? Anything that's come up on your end?
Yeah. So, I mean, just in general, this will come up in my sweets, so we'll get there. However, just in general, I do think it's important to be mindful of your caffeine and your caffeine timing. So I am a huge advocate for not coffee before breakfast, the opposite, breakfast before coffee, because what happens when we have caffeine first in the morning? Typically, we are suppressing our appetite a bit, so then we may not end up eating until 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is not good for our GI, for our blood sugar regulation, or for our hormones, right? Our hormones want food, as you could hear from all these different phases. They're looking for these different foods. What also happens when we have caffeine before food is that we tend to spike our cortisol even higher than it already is. Now, I feel like cortisol is super taboo, so I'm not here to say that cortisol is the make or break of everything. We do need cortisol. It's essentially the opposite of melatonin, right? So melatonin puts us to sleep, cortisol wakes us up. So we need it in the morning. However, if it is too elevated or prolonged elevation, that's when we start to see issues, right? That's when we start to see issues with gut microbiome, some dysregulation. We start to see blood sugar shifts and also more sensitivity with our blood sugar too. So we could eat something that typically wouldn't cause a blood sugar spike, but it would. So that's why I'm typically a proponent of eating something. I usually would say within like an hour to 90 minutes of waking up. You know, our insulin is the most responsive in the morning, so it's going to be the best time for blood sugar control. And also our digestion is just kind of getting started, right? We want to put some fuel in the tank. So I know you mentioned, you know, skipping breakfast and having coffee instead. Well, when it comes to energy, the coffee can only get us so far, whereas the food is really the fuel and really that energy. So we might see a little energy, but then that's when we're going to start to have those midday crashes where we're feeling like exhausted at 2 o'clock, and then we end up having like a huge meal for lunch, and then we're tired again after that because our body is getting into that rest and digest to break down all that stuff that we ate.
Yeah, and then you have cravings because you didn't eat enough in the morning. So that's where sometimes the cravings come from. And again, we're not saying like don't have your sweets when you're really craving it during certain phases, but recognize if you're craving foods because you're not eating the nourishing foods for your body. So a big thing I say, you kind of said it, is we don't, we might not always want fruit. We want the chocolate. But if you're not getting enough fruit, and think of all the other nutrients we said are in fruit and vegetables of all different colors, if you're not getting those foods, maybe that's why you're always craving chocolate. Have it during your time of month where that's when you want it, but see how much you want. See if you're not consuming the other foods.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say too, like going off that, Emily, like with, people not consuming enough, we're usually going to crave then the more high calorie nutrient, like dense foods or like calorie dense foods that, like we eat late at night that, we feel like we shouldn't be. But again, if you're trying to make up for something that you didn't have throughout the entire day, you're going to want just all that energy, high calorie food to basically sustain you. And then sometimes then you can't sleep because you had either a really heavy meal or you had a lot of sugar, or like you just didn't balance out everything. So then, your blood sugar spikes, whatever. Like it's like a vicious cycle again where all of that comes into play, whether you realize it or not. And, those choices affect you throughout the entire day. So they weren't kidding when they said breakfast is the most important meal of the day, right? Because that is really setting yourself up for either success, and I don't want to say failure, but just like how the rest of your day is going to go and how maybe stressed you feel. And that's also going to affect the rest of your hormones. So we're talking about cortisol and melatonin and the production of that. And it's all just going to interplay with everything. So nutrition is such an important part of this. And I don't know if people realize how much nutrition interplays with all of your hormone health. So
yeah,
awesome. I love it.
No, absolutely. And I think you wouldn't believe it. I mean, you would believe. You guys are both dietitians, so you talk to people all the time. However, the amount of people that I talk to that don't necessarily realize that connection, right, between breakfast and late night snacking, because they're just thinking, okay, well, breakfast was so long ago. The late night snacking is obviously something different. But I feel like I always put it in these terms of our brain is really smart, right? And it doesn't always know if we're making a particular decision, right? If you're saying, well, I'm going to skip breakfast because I'm trying to, cut back on calories or something like that, your brain isn't identifying that you're just trying to do that for your health. Your brain is saying, okay, well, I really need to get in these calories because I need it for my organs to function. And it knows fundamentally that these high carbohydrate foods, whether it is like chips or pretzels or popcorn or cake or candy or sweets, it knows that these high carbohydrate foods are typically energy dense, so they're high in calories, and also can be very easily digested. So your brain is just playing this game, or not even a game really. Your brain is just fundamentally saying, I know this is going to be the quickest way to energy. And that's why we have a lot of those cravings for those foods, because they're just, at the end of the day, they're the highest carbohydrate foods and the easiest to get energy from.
I do have another follow-up question. So we're talking about the cravings, but I was thinking back to folate is such a huge nutrient that's also kind of come into, I think, a little bit of social media, trending, but also just we emphasize folate so much when you are getting pregnant and when you are trying to have a baby. But does folate interplay with any of the other cycle phases, and does it interplay with any of that? Is that something we should also be focusing on? I know you mentioned B6 and fiber, which also kind of maybe there's going to be folate in some of those foods, but is there an emphasis, and if so, is there a specific place that we should be emphasizing it?
That's a good question. I feel like I typically would emphasize more in that realm of B vitamins during your luteal phase. Now, of course, if we're thinking about pregnancy, I think folate is important really pre-ovulation and even just months in advance, right? So folate is a B vitamin, meaning that we're not really holding on to all this extra folate like we would with vitamin D, for example. So we do need to get it on a regular basis. I think that's really where taking a prenatal well in advance of trying to get pregnant is so, thoughtful and important. I would say in general terms, I would emphasize, folate in that B vitamins category during that luteal phase, just for support with energy. So it does help with metabolism and energy synthesis. Now, also, thinking about the importance of folate for pregnancy, it can help to prevent neural tube defects in the fetus. So thinking about that, it is important to get it regularly in advance. Typically, we do see that kind of through a prenatal most often, because prenatals typically are well above, the folate that you would typically need in a day. But I would say in general, maybe emphasizing more during the luteal phase. I wouldn't talk about it too much generally, but I think that could be where I would see it fit.
And can I just pinpoint too, when Aubrey, and correct me if I'm wrong, when Aubrey's saying focus on these nutrients, it's not that we don't always want these nutrients.
Right.
It's we want to make sure we're getting adequate amounts, especially at that time. Or maybe you need to increase a little bit, because that's what's going to help you during that time feel a little bit better, promote, the use of your hormones and adequate nutrition. So again, it's not, we're saying don't eat vitamin B and folate and all that at the other times of your cycle, but nourish your body enough during those cycle times.
Yes.
Phases, excuse me.
Yes. And I do think that again shows just the importance of that well-rounded diet as well, because hypothetically, in a perfect world, you are getting enough folate, you are getting enough B6, you are getting all of these different vitamins throughout the day, right? So hypothetically, in a perfect world, you're always getting in these nutrients. But like Emily said, maybe you're emphasizing maybe a little more of certain nutrients, or emphasizing really making sure, for example, you're hitting your fiber goal. You know, a lot of us don't get enough fiber. So maybe during our follicular phase, we really are trying to get that 25 grams per day if normally we're getting like 18 or 20. I think it's just putting that extra emphasis on those particular nutrients, because if we were thinking about every vitamin, every mineral, every macronutrient, we would drive ourselves insane doing all of these calculations every single day. We would have to weigh out all our food and put it into a nutrient analysis software, and that just would be too much, quite frankly.
3 days was enough during undergrad to try and make fit for that whatever 100,000 calorie diet we had to do. I don't know if you guys had to do that, but I did, and it was a pain to get that iron where it needed to be for a pregnant woman.
Exactly. So I think, just leaning into some of those, foods and nutrients at different times, it can just help you maximize those different phases in your cycle, right? It can help you with symptom management, or it can help you maximizing your energy, or it can help you with egg quality, but we don't necessarily have to think about this minutia every day in every cycle. It's more just where we can put maybe a little emphasis if we are thinking about one particular phase.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum of how we just encompassed, like, we want to have a well-balanced diet. We want to make sure that we're getting everything. Sometimes, obviously, that's not always the case. And you even said, in a perfect world, this is what would happen. But we obviously do not live in a perfect world. So I think something that's also very high and trendy, especially with this cycle, like nutrition that's been trending, is then, of course, becomes the supplement train, like of, well, you need this supplement to fuel your luteal phase so you don't feel like crap or whatever. And obviously some of that is very gimmicky and, influencery. But in terms of actually considering supplementation, obviously we know, but maybe other people don't, like, blood work is going to be the number one thing, I believe, to check to see if you are deficient in any nutrients specifically. But so let's say someone does get a panel, and they find out that they're nutrient deficient in something. Do you see a lot of nutrient deficiencies with people that are focusing on this? And if so, like, do you recommend supplements, or like how do you go about that, I guess?
I would say that nutrient deficiencies are much less common than maybe the influencer industry. I don't know that the influencer industry even really is alluding to deficiencies. It's more just like in excess. I would say the most common deficiency I see, and I'm sure you both can relate, is vitamin D. I think especially we live in Pennsylvania, and so we're in a more northern area where typically, so for a little background, vitamin D is most often synthesized just from sunlight exposure. It's not in a ton of foods. It's in fatty fish, eggs, mushrooms, not in super high quantities there. So we see a lot in this area vitamin D deficiency. I would say that's the most common I see, typically very easily corrected through supplementation. I would say 80% of the people I talk to are probably already on a vitamin D supplement, whether it's because they have lab work and are correctively working on it, or they just take it as part of their kind of like routine day to day. A lot of people are taking a multivitamin, maybe not necessarily needed to like just catch all and grab everything. But I think sometimes that just makes people feel better too about feeling like they're getting kind of all of those nutrients as well. But I would say I typically most often see vitamin D deficiency. I don't really see a ton of other deficiencies. So I don't think that supplementation is typically necessary outside of the realm of fertility and trying to conceive. I do see the value and benefit in a prenatal, because we really want to ensure that mom and baby are both getting adequate nutrients. And the one other thing that sometimes I recommend is an omega-3 or a fish oil supplement, especially in people. I talk to a lot of people who are like, I don't really like to eat fish. I don't eat fish a lot. I don't like fish. And it's in our nuts and seeds, omega-3s, but it's a different form that's not necessarily as readily utilized as what we find in our fish and our seafood. And so sometimes I'll recommend an omega-3 supplement. But outside of that, I wouldn't say I'm typically recommending like tons and tons of supplements, nor am I seeing lots of deficiencies that would call for them.
Well, and I was thinking too, and I apologize if you could hear the train. I was thinking though too, like if people aren't eating the fatty fish or even just like the healthy fatty foods, so like nuts, seeds, things like that, that omega-3, 6, or fish oil supplement can help also with the vitamin D absorption, because that is a fat soluble vitamin. So that's going to help absorb both, the vitamin D and the omega-3, omega-6. So, that's something to consider. If you don't tend to eat a lot of those foods, you're not going to be like, well, instead I'm just going to like chug olive oil or something. I don't know, like, or you're just going to, then just think, oh, well, if it's a fat soluble vitamin and I absorb it with fat, then I can just have, French fries. Like, that's not the route you want to go. So that might also be a good route. So I just want to emphasize that. And yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah.
The reason why I asked is, like I said, I think so many influencers are just like, oh, like I want this supplement. And we all know that that's just making your urine really expensive.
Exactly, right? And supplements aren't cheap, like you said. It's making your urine really expensive. I think the one thing is you can't necessarily supplement your way to your goals, right? And maybe if your goal is better vitamin D levels in your labs, then yes, you can certainly supplement your way there. But in general, it's really about the bigger picture. So I also, just to go off for 1 second, I also work in the oncology space. And so I think a lot of times the conversations I have there are also very supplement based. And I always say, there is no one food or there is no one supplement that causes or cures anything, right? So when it comes to that, I think if an influencer, right, is like, take this supplement to cure all your PMS symptoms during your luteal phase, it probably isn't going to do that, right? Just like in the same, there's nothing that causes you to have a terrible luteal phase right from one specific food, because it is really about this bigger picture. So I think one thing too I always hear is people taking a lot of supplements and then taking it with their coffee in the morning without having breakfast. And that's really making your pee expensive, because you're not even getting the fat to absorb all these nutrients.
Yeah, right? Oh my gosh. And I think we share that commonality of oncology. And like you said, the supplements are there. Are there any differences when we're younger and just kind of starting our menstrual cycle in adolescence compared to when we grow older? We'll not get into the menopause stage or anything like that, but just when we are menstruating, any either nutrient deficiencies or any changes that we might see in our phases of our cycle?
That's a good question. And yeah, I'll have to come back and I'll have to talk about menopause and perimenopause. That's a whole other topic.
Yes,
but I think when it comes to menstruation, a lot of times maybe we'll see like heavier or more irregular periods earlier in menstruation. I do feel like our bodies kind of start to acclimate and adjust, of course, depending on, our hormonal birth control use and then other conditions like PCOS. However, we may see more issues with like iron deficiency, anemia earlier in our menstruation journey, just because our body is just starting out. Typically, we're also maybe like in a smaller body as well too. We're still growing, for example. Maybe we're not eating the most well-balanced diet at the age of 10. I don't know. So thinking about that, I think we do tend to see more of that like iron deficiency and more of the heavier bleeding and more irregular bleeding typically earlier. But I do think everybody is very different when it comes to that. So I think especially even person to person, some people really struggle with heavy periods where that iron addition may be much more important than somebody who has a lighter period. So I think, again, even person to person, it can be very different when it comes to like timing and deficiencies and what we may see throughout the cycle.
No, that's good to know too. And you mentioned like growing adolescents. I think that's a huge thing. Like they have their own growth needs. So then add a menstrual cycle on top of it. They're already irritable as that age and they're annoyed and they're probably really angry that they have this menstrual cycle. So add all this together. But then also, like, I work with athletes at a younger age that are adolescents. So add on being an athlete, add on doing additional extracurricular activities as an adolescent with this, and needs continue to be increased. So you mentioned like iron deficiency. That's a huge thing that we should be monitoring. And I think, referrals, we talk about this in many of our conversations, is that refer to a dietitian so we can assess what's actually what they're actually consuming, what their diet really looks like. Is it feasible for them to get it in their diet and to absorb it? And then if not, then that's where supplementation comes in. And that's to be continued as far as reassessing if they need it. So I'm glad you touched on that. And I think bringing in a younger age group just to the conversation, that there are different needs for different ages and what to look for then too, and different levels of how your menstrual cycle looks too.
Exactly. And I love that idea or just mentality of like reassessing, right? Even when it comes to something like vitamin D, right? There's always a need to reassess. And so I think that is such a benefit of having a broad care team. I'm all about having multiple providers, a dietitian included. I think a lot of times what I tell people is my goal is to work with you regularly until you feel comfortable. And then I become like a PCP or a dentist where you're seeing me biannually or once per year, for example, because there is always that reevaluation, right? We want to see how are things going. So I love that concept.
Yeah, I think it's super important to continue to have that relationship and again, reassess, see where you're at. We're not here to like bug you all the time. We're here to help you and just find those, areas that maybe you're not getting adequate amounts in. So I think one of our last things we wanted to touch on is just like the myths that are around the menstrual cycle. And so, one of these being you should eat the same way all month. So do we say that's false or true with what we've talked about today? Mickey, you want to answer? Or Aubrey, go ahead.
Well, I think Aubrey's going to answer, or we could just all answer together at this point, but like that's clearly false. We've covered that pretty well. All right. Next one is cravings mean that you don't have any willpower.
I would say also false, right? We touched on how really it matters what you eat during the day to impact your cravings, and your hormones impact your cravings too. So it's got nothing to do with willpower, really.
And I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, but maybe if you want to go into a little bit more detail with this one specifically, you can't exercise on your period. That's a common myth that sometimes we hear. So can you exercise on your period?
Yeah. I mean, you can. It's fine if you don't want to. You're more than welcome to not exercise during your period, but you're not doing your body any harm by exercising during your period. I do think it's very fair to lean more towards like lighter and less intense exercise. However, I will say your period begins this menstrual phase, but also your follicular phase where you're starting to have more energy. So while you may not feel the best, you may have some decent performance when it comes to movement. So I would say, yes, you absolutely can exercise during your period. You can exercise at any time of your phase, but maybe you're just tailoring it to where you're at and what your energy levels are.
Yeah, and maybe, we can cover this, but you both I mean, Emily, you work with athletes a lot, but like, do you see a lot of guilt with athletes in terms of maybe not wanting to, perform or do the activity or exercise or train? And like, just in general, maybe some people might feel guilt for not wanting to do the thing, whatever the thing is. So I don't know, you both can probably talk more on that than I can. So I'd love to
I
hear
think
on
in
that.
actual athletes, I'm just thinking because I was a coach too. I didn't see any real change in activity. I mean, maybe obviously I didn't know when their cycles were, although sometimes they shared that, which is fine. I think for a coach, female coach, maybe a male coach, it depends on how comfortable you are. But I think for a coach to know that, just to understand, like, okay, you might not be on your game point, today, like that's okay. But also like seeing, as you mentioned, Aubrey, like you could perform just fine. So I think as a coach, I never saw any like significant change. But I think in more of the non-athlete population, people have guilt of like, I just don't have any energy to do it. And well, no, duh, you're losing blood. Like, of course, your iron levels are low. You're not getting oxygen. Your muscles aren't able to work as well. That's fine. Understandable. Like you said, do lighter activity, be more kind to your body, and do movement that you enjoy. If you run usually and you want to walk instead, nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and I can't say that I've really worked with a ton of athletes, so I can't speak from that perspective, but I think I've worked with a lot of women, and I think a lot of women who are looking to lose weight as well. So obviously physical activity is part of that. I think there is a lot of guilt around like menstruation and lower energy and maybe changing activity levels or feeling like you have to push past it, right? And even though you feel terrible, making yourself exercise. So I do think it is important to listen to your body at all times. I'm a huge advocate for that. Even if you're in your follicular phase and you go for a run and a mile and you feel terrible, your body's telling you something, right? Your body is saying you maybe were meant to do this today, and that's okay. So I think, being gentle with yourself, especially during your menstrual phase, right? When you're already going through so much in your body, and moving how it feels good for you to move.
And so the last myth myth, I guess, that we have is being emotional during your period is just an excuse.
During your period, we have such a drop of estrogen and progesterone, and our bodies are, first of all, just going through so much, right? We're shedding this uterine lining. And so I think, especially too, with the rapid drop in our hormones, it absolutely makes sense for you to feel vulnerable, maybe even low when it comes to mood, or maybe more irritable as well. Because a lot of times things like our estrogen, for example, give us energy and make us feel better. And we're at our lowest of lows when it comes to estrogen. So it is not just an excuse to feel moody. It is a very biological reason for feeling emotional during your period.
Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean you could use it the entire month long of, oh, like I'm just emotional or I'm overreacting. But there is some sensitivities around, specific times. And again, having grace with yourself, or, just being understanding like, okay, there's a lot of hormonal changes happening. Like, it's okay to feel the way I feel. And like, again, that doesn't give you the right to, yell and scream and, cry hysterically all the time. But if that's happening, maybe go see a different doctor.
Dramatic people will be dramatic people.
But yeah, there is definitely that change. But awesome. I think, I don't know, Aubrey, to kind of close us out, if you have any like main takeaways from today that you just want people to take home with them, or even like a personal client experience that you'd like to share, obviously, within reason, but just like anything that you'd want to share about this topic to finish us out, and then we'll get into sweet and sours.
Yeah, I think I would just say that when it comes to hormones and your cycle, right, we're all going through this experience together. So I think being gentle with yourself, being gentle with everybody around you, right? Even if you know somebody's cycle and what that looks like, I think still being gentle with everybody. But I think really the take home message is just listening to your body and using it as a tool to fuel yourself for success, right? So you are going to feel good and not so great at different times in your cycle. And I think we can get discouraged, especially in those times that we're feeling not the best. But I think if we really can sync our lives to our cycle as best we can within reason, right? We can't just call out of work during our entire luteal phase. However, if we can sync our lifestyle to that as much as possible, you will probably feel as though you really are able to maximize on things like your nutrition, your lifestyle, your movement. So I think just listening to your body is the key. And knowing too that even if you are on hormonal birth control and you're not maybe seeing or feeling these ebbs and flows, that you can still be mindful of your nutrition and your body, and you may still have some of these ebbs and flows. So that's very fair as well too.
Aubrey, we both have two follow-up questions that we just thought of. So
Great.
one of our questions is kind of related, but I want to kind of circle back to something you literally just said. And so with the hormonal birth control, people can still feel those ebbs and flows, though, depending on the type that they're on. In some capacity, right? Like it may not be as dramatic, but there may still be some ebbs and flows, correct?
Yes, yeah. There still are likely going to be some ebbs and flows. For some people, they feel it. They're just more sensitive to it. I will say, we're typically suppressing ovulation. A lot of times we are shifting really the sincerity in which like our estrogen, our progesterone are ebbing and flowing throughout the month. But that doesn't mean that we can't still feel these changes. So I think even if you are on hormonal birth control, you could always keep track of your period, for example. So keep track of your period if you are getting one, or keep track of your symptoms if you're not getting one. I know a lot of people on hormonal IUDs don't get a regular cycle, for example. So just keep track of where you are, how you feel when it comes to energy, brain fog, cramping, headaches. These are all symptoms that we may experience during the late luteal phase, heading into when we're supposed to have our period. So it can help you identify where your ebbs and flows are.
And speaking of keeping track, then, where can we keep track of these things? Like, obviously, there's phone apps. Do you have any you recommend and any other resources that anyone can use for their menstrual cycle and beyond?
Yeah, so I always say I don't necessarily have one app or app recommendations. I think that it really just depends on you personally and what you prefer. So you could search on your Android or your iPhone, like period tracker, and there are probably 100 different apps. I would say my biggest thing is you don't really need to pay for one. You could certainly get a free option. You may be able to pay for one. Like I feel like Natural Cycles is really big right now. So you may be able to get ones that are a little bit more in depth, right? Maybe you're taking your temperature, things of that nature. However, I would say either using just your phone notes app, using a journal, or using a tracking app. So like MyFlow is one of them, but again, there's lots of different apps that you can utilize. I think Android or iPhone, there are tons of great ones to track your symptoms and track your period. That's really where just to get started. Start by your next period, keeping track of when it starts and when it ends. And then maybe you don't necessarily track much during the month, but the next month you track when it starts and when it ends. And now you know how long your cycle length is. And now you can make some of these predictions for where you may be at each various day throughout the month.
Thanks. Awesome. Any other resources that you share with clients as a go-to?
Yeah, so I will say, and I was just looking in here too as well, that there is a book that I have read, and I will sometimes recommend it to clients, although it can be, I feel like, a little bit clinical. There's just a lot of information in it. It's called Hormone Intelligence by Aviva Romm. Talks a lot about really being mindful of your cycle. I think the beginning of the book is really helpful because it talks about understanding your cycle at length. It talks about changes in cervical mucus and how that's how you can identify the different phases of your cycle. So I do think that that book can be really supportive for more of a clinical and kind of understanding your cycle aspect. Talks a lot about nutrition. I think it can be a little bit rigid, and I'm a very flexible person, but it does give some really specific recommendations as well too when it comes to like herbals and things to support when you're having different symptoms. So sometimes I'll recommend that just as like a good read when it comes to resources.
Well, thank you so much. I learned so much. I wish we would have gotten like a CEU for this.
I think I'm going to have to pitch this to CDR.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, it's funny you should both say that because we can technically apply to have our podcast count for CEUs. So maybe Emily and I need to look into that and have that count because we can do that, believe it or not. I believe there's a couple podcasts out there that also they grant like a CEU per episode. So stay tuned for that. Surprise. We'll see what happens with that. But that is a possibility. But yeah, Aubrey, this was great. Like I said, I also learned a lot. Some of those questions were actually questions of my own. So, fun times. I'm not going to tell you which ones, but I'm going to pretend like I knew so much. And I could appreciate your cup because it is RD squeeze coated, whether you planned that or not. I
love it.
I did not. Do you know how in your house you have like nice glasses and then you have plastic cups? This is my go-to plastic cup, my lemonade cup.
Yes, I do also have a go-to plastic cup. It's got pineapples on it. I typically don't have it for the podcast. I usually use our little mugs that we got from Carmen and Joe. But yeah, there's like that one comfort cup, and it's usually like a plastic cup that's like, like the one that you won't give the company, but you are happily like, that's my cup. So I love that. But yeah, this was awesome. So I think without further ado, we are going to get into our sweet and sours, and we're going to make you go first. So I hope you came prepared. I mean, you're not new here. So
I thought about it this morning. I said, what am I going to say? It's funny because the sour I thought of, I was like, I'm pretty sure I said that last time, so I'm going to say something different. It was about mowing the grass. I hate mowing the grass, everybody. However, my sweet, very exciting. Or should I start with the sour? I'm sorry, let me backtrack.
You can do whatever you want, Aubrey. You're the guest. There's no rules here.
My sweet, which is very exciting. I have had my business for 4 years, and since I have had it, I have always really wanted to create some sort of course, and I think I've just never had the time and I've never had the energy. However, I had this idea like 2 months ago, why not create a mini course, right? It doesn't have to be this huge massive thing that has all of this workload into it. So I started reflecting on what are some of my most common things I hear, something that people could work on. And so funny we talked about it today. My mini course is called Coffee Isn't Breakfast. It launched yesterday. And so it is a 5-step guided course with also a 7-day breakfast challenge to help people start integrating breakfast. Talks about hormonal implications, when to time your coffee, things like that. So I'm very excited that launched. That is my sweet.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Awesome. You have to give us the link to that and everything so we can put that in our notes.
Absolutely.
So people can get access to that. That's awesome. Yes. Congrats.
Thank you. So very excited about my mini course. And my sour, I feel like it's a sweet into a sour, is that this past weekend was my birthday. Yay, very exciting. We had a party. However, I have been cleaning up from the party since this weekend. So I feel like I'm finally getting to the point where the house almost looks normal. I haven't looked at the outside yet. That's this weekend.
What kind of party did you have, Aubrey? No, I'm just kidding.
We have such a nice backyard, so we have like all the lawn games still sitting outside and like stuff on the patio. So yes, so I am my sour is that I have been cleaning.
Oh, well, that's a fun sour though. That's like very happy birthday, and that's awesome. Like,
yeah.
And good for you. I mean, hey, I know that sucks. Like, you don't want to clean up for your birthday. That's not a gift, but
yeah,
hey, that's pretty cool. But
yes,
Emily, I'll go next because mine is not like a good concluding one, I guess. So I don't want to be the last thought.
You're good.
Because it's also kind of a sweet and a sour. And I don't know, maybe you all have insights on this, but yesterday for one of our improv practices, we did like a sound bowl healing session or a sound, like the sound baths. And I had never done that before. I don't know if either of you have. And I really enjoyed it right afterwards. But I did end up having like some very like emotional reaction later on. And I felt very like disconnected from myself. So I don't know if I have like more healing to do. So like it was really good initially, but then it turned sour because I'm like, and I'm very sore this morning, which I'm like, I didn't do anything like super physical. Like, so I don't know if I slept tense or like it had something to do with that, but it's just like very weird. But I enjoyed it at the same time. I found it very relaxing. So I'm just like, I don't know. Have either of you done that before? Have you ever heard of
I have, yeah. And my mom had a similar experience to you, Mickey. So, and she has vertigo. So, that kind of played a role into it with the continued vibration of the sound healing. So maybe there's something along that. I'm not a professional at that. I am not a sound healer, but potentially.
Yeah, I'm not either. And so Terry, who did it, maybe we can even have her as a guest, because she's actually a comedian too, but like she did not do stand up while doing the sound healing. And I'm kind of shouting her out, but like it was an amazing session. Like I said, I really did enjoy it initially, but I do get migraines, so I was like kind of reading up on like you can't have some adverse reactions if you experience so many things or whatever. But it was just very interesting, and we all had different reactions. Like someone was very energized after, someone was very tired after. So it was just very interesting to see the variations. But I don't know, Aubrey, have you ever done that before?
I've done a sound bath before. I haven't had a negative reaction. I feel like my experience, and I don't know if this makes any sense, it feels like the sound bath is like itching that one part of your brain that's like really itchy in the back of your mind. I probably sound so crazy, but
no, you don't at all. And I mean, I genuinely do experience ASMR, so like I do have like sensitive ears, I guess, or like that nerve, like, because some people say, oh, it's ASMR and it's just relaxing. Like, no, I genuinely get like those itchies when like certain noises trigger me and stuff. So I'm wondering if like that also had something to do with it, because I could feel it like in one ear and like kind of moving, like, and obviously I was just sitting there, like it wasn't like she was in one ear and like it felt like I had headphones in, but I didn't, like it was live. So it was very strange. But yeah, like it did feel good. Like I felt like it was getting that itch. I know exactly what you're talking about. And like I said, I just wonder if like I'm more sensitive to that or something. I don't know. It was weird. But I'm not saying that like someone shouldn't do it, because it was very enjoyable initially. But then I just felt like I was crying. I was like very like all over the place. And I was like, what is going on? So yeah, it was weird, but good times.
Maybe your chakras are all unaligned now. You
well,
gotta line them back up.
I said maybe I just have more healing to do, because it was a short session, so maybe I was like only half healed and I just need more time. Who knows?
You stopped mid-heal. So
yes, that's what I'm going with. I'm like, maybe I just had a lot more healing to do because I had never done it before. So yeah, so that's my sweet and sour, because it was awesome. Okay. and then it wasn't.
Well, good experience, but yeah, I can understand the sour aspect of that too. We don't want anyone to go through that. All right, so I will end us up here. So I will start with my sour. It kind of is a sour into a sweet, but I have a different sweet. So I was asked to step in to do a presentation in September at an annual meeting, And I come to find out they told me the presentation was done and it's not done. So now I have to do this presentation, and the slides are due next week. So I have a week to do this. Thankfully, there were already some pre-slides on there. However, my mind works where I'd rather a clean slate sometimes, and it gets a little too confusing when more information is out there. So even though I want all the info, I think I need to like create the slides myself instead of looking at what slides are already made. So that's my sour. Got a lot of work to do in the next week. And then I'll end on my sweet. So I guess the sweet from that is I get to present at an annual meeting.
That's exciting. Congrats.
Yeah, thanks. And it's a little vacation there too. We're going to Phoenix, so I'm excited for that. I've never been to Phoenix, so. So then my actual sweet then is that, so everyone knows I have a garden, and our pickles and tomatoes and our spaghetti squash are going crazy. So I finally was able to make pickles. I did not make them last year. At least I don't believe I did. And if I did, it was like only a couple jars. I made like 10 jars, if not more, of pickles. And I actually tried to make spears this time. So instead of just the round chip versions, I made spears. So they are delicious. I can't wait to make more. I have a drawer full still, so I have to make more. But I'm super excited that I got to make homemade pickles this year in our new garden. So
Emily, you'll have to tell me what you put in your pickles when you're pickling them, because our cucumbers are starting to go crazy, and I can only eat so many cucumbers.
Right. I try and eat one a day, and then I'm like, okay, I can't eat any more, but they're still coming.
Well, you all can send me any of your, I can totally help you consume some of
I'll remember that. Maybe I'll stop by this weekend.
Yeah, because I do love, I'm a pickle gal, so I will take pickles, but we do have like a very small like garden, and like I have like little herbs and stuff, and we did just start getting some tomatoes and peppers, but we were not successful on the cucumber front. So not that I need to eat one every day, but if you have excess, happy to help out. But also not begging, totally understand, but but that's awesome. Yeah, you guys have the green thumbs. I do not.
All right, so we're going to end out. Mickey, do you want to end us, or you want me to?
Sure, I can end us out. First, thank you so much, Aubrey, for part 2 of what I think will be many more appearances on the RD Squeeze, because we have so much to talk to you about, and you're just very awesome, and you're a great guest, and you have so much wonderful insights. So thank you again for joining us twice. Hopefully you're not sick of us.
Never.
Good. And, for me and Emily, if you're in the mood for a boost of juice, you should always check out new episodes of the RD Squeeze on Sundays. We did just take a break, but we're back for season 4. Very exciting. We have a bunch of awesome episodes coming up. And yeah, be sure to stay tuned. Follow us on Instagram, all that fun stuff. But we will see you next time. Bye.
Be sure to follow us on Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram. We will always take topics you want to hear about, so message us for any topics you want to see covered on the RD Squeeze. Don't forget, it's Dietitian with a T. We'll see you next time on the RD Squeeze.